read your thoughts. From the future.
The movies of 1985.
Well, hello there, and welcome to episode 41, week 41 of the year 1985. That's Tuesday the 8th of October to Monday the 14th of October 1985. My name is Jason Hutchins, and like I do every week, I am going to select a random movie to watch by selecting a ball from a bingo machine. I'll then go and rent that movie on VHS, and we can sit down on the sofa and watch it together. So why don't I spin the bingo machine right now and see what comes out. Let's see, a ball is out. There's only, 12 or so left. It's number 14 this week, and I'll just look that up on my spreadsheet. Number 14 is a movie called Vagabond. Vagabond, a movie from France. It might be hard to get in the future where you reside in the year 2025, but here in 1985, I'm pretty sure they have an international section at Network Video in Mount Hawthorn. So I'm going to go over there and see if I can rent Vagabond. I'll be back in a jiffy, but while I'm away, I'll flick on the TV so you can watch an ad.
Let me in, Sean! Let me in!
No! I was in here first.
I bet you're using my Colgate gel!
Tastes terrific too.
Sean's brushing with Colgate Fluorogard Gel, the most proven fluoride protection a toothpaste can give. With such a good taste, kids want to brush and brush.
Just pop this in.
Time!
Colgate Fluorogard Gel makes kids want to brush with the most proven protection against decay.
So I'm back with the VHS videotape of the French movie Vagabond. Now, just looking at the front, we've got up in the top left corner in purple writing on a white background, it says, a film by Agnes Varda. Now, I don't know anything about the director Agnes Varda, female director, starring Sandrine Bonnaire. And there's a photograph of a young woman in a leather jacket and a scarf looking very bleak with heavy eye makeup by the looks of it and dishevelled hair. And spray painted over the top of that in red paint is the word Vagabond. That's the cover. Over on the back, straight away, right up the top, first prize, Venice Film Festival, Best Foreign Film, LA Film Critics Association, Best Actress, Sandrine Bonnaire. Both the French César and LA Film Critics Association awarded her Best Actress. Then we get the red spray-painted Vagabond. And down the bottom, Vagabond is the story of Mona, an aimless drifter whose only desire in life is to be truly free. Interesting, there's a lot of movies about drifters in 1985. We had that a little bit with Lost in America, but also that disconnection from society you see a bit in movies like The Breakfast Club, don't you? Anyway, as she wanders through the wintry French countryside, Mona encounters violence, hunger, fear, and cold. She deeply touches the lives of people she meets on the road, confronting them with her own ideas of freedom. Vagabond is an unforgettable character and an unforgettable film, richly deserving its many awards. And then down the bottom, French with English subtitles, 105 minutes colour, 1985 Cine Tampras Films. So there you go. I think it's time now to press play on tape and watch the film Vagabond.
J'aimerais mieux m'en aller. Cette fille qui est venue chercher de l'eau, elle était libre. Elle va où elle veut.
Peut-être qu'elle ne mange pas à sa faim tous les jours, servie par sa mère.
Des fois, ce serait mieux de ne pas manger. Moi, j'aimerais être libre. J'aimerais être libre.
Y'a quelqu'un?
Ouais, je dors.
Mais vous savez où vous êtes là?
Bah non, je suis arrivée dans la nuit.
Mais c'est un cimetière, il faut pas rester là.
Oh.
Wow. What a fascinating movie this one is. I was unprepared for that. It is very interesting, right up my alley. Very much an art house movie. Now, like I said, this won the Golden Lion at Venice. It premiered in September 1985, just last month. This made Agnes Varda the second woman ever to win top prize at Venice. Now, in the year 2025, only 6 women have won. So in the 40 years, we've only had 4 winners. So that's 1 every 10 years, isn't it? That's kind of tragic. And Agnes Varda made this film after spending months alone walking and tramping around the Languedoc region in southern France. She was a bit of a photographer, so she was taking a lot of photographs. It was during the off-season, so no tourists. Everything winds down a bit. And she started picking up young female hitchhikers as she was travelling around. One of them, a young woman named Satina Ahab, actually appears in this movie in a very short scene where there was some improvised dialogue between her and an elderly former orphan. And when you realise that this movie features a lot of non-professional actors or non-actors, they are just the inhabitants of this place with a few professional actors in the major roles, it is so interesting, and you get this real documentary feel as if it's a real story. So Varda had noticed this social phenomenon emerging in the 80s where young people were just disconnecting from society, and more young women were becoming vagrants, just dropping out of society and travelling around homeless, just going wherever their fortunes might take them in ways that previous generations hadn't. Now, before we get into it too much, let's go into the first 6 minutes. I'm only going to do the first 6 minutes because this just sets up the story so beautifully. So we fade in to a still shot of a vineyard, like a photograph, in the French countryside with a tractor slowly coming towards us from the distance. It looks like maybe it's harvesting the grapes off the vines or I'm not sure what it's doing, but it's running alongside a row of grapevines. In the background, there's this very distinctive hill, oddly shaped hill, with 2 trees on top. It's quite striking. And it was actually used as the album cover of Elvis Costello's 1984 album, Goodbye Cruel World, which is a bit of a coincidence. Now we get the titles and chamber strings on the soundtrack, so you know it's art house. And you realise after a while that the camera's been slowly zooming in to the scene until we see a worker who's pruning the vines by hand on the other side of the field from where the tractor was. At about 3 minutes, we cut to a tracking shot of him walking along the row of vines picking up branches. Now, there are 13 tracking shots like this throughout the movie, and they delimit different chapters of the story, which is quite clever. So you know when you're going into a new chapter because it sets things up with the camera tracking along horizontally like that. Now, this worker stops because he's shocked to see the dead body of a young woman in a ditch by the grapevines, and he drops his bundle of twigs and runs into the farm to report it. The gendarmes are summoned, so the police turn up looking very much like the police in Subway the other week with their funny hats on, and the farm helpers are interviewed about this young woman in a very documentary style. And like I say, a lot of non-actors played roles in this movie. The body's covered with wine dregs, and one of the old men explains that she was dunked in a barrel of wine. We find out exactly what happened at the end of the movie. But while he's saying this, there are cutaways of splashed wine being cleaned off buildings in the nearby village. The police conclude pretty quickly that she's frozen to death of natural causes, and they wrap her body up in plastic. A bit of a Twin Peaksy thing there. We then get a voiceover from the director herself saying, "No one claimed the body, so it went from ditch to municipal grave. She died a natural death without leaving a trace. I wonder, do those who knew her as a child still think of her? People she had met recently remembered her. Those witnesses helped me to tell the story of her final winter. She left her mark on them." So it's very interesting to have the director just making a statement, a verbal statement like that right at the beginning of a movie, but that's kind of in the documentary style of it, isn't it? The camera then cuts to a beach and we follow seagull footprints along the sand until we arrive at the surf, the waves crashing into the beach with a naked girl emerging from them. This, of course, is the girl whose dead body was discovered, Mona, and the voiceover continues saying, "They spoke of her not knowing that she died. I didn't tell them, nor that her name was Mona Bergeron. I know little about her myself, but it seems to me that she came from the sea." And that's the 6-minute mark, and that pretty much sets up the movie. So now we're going to see her life as it was before she died, the events that were leading up to that. Now, when Varda cast this young actress, Sandrine Bonnaire, I think she was only 17 years old, and they never talked about where Mona came from, like whether it was the sea or somewhere else, or why she was on the road travelling around as a vagabond. They only focused on practical reasons, like the practical day-to-day, just getting by. You know, how does she live? Where does she find food? Where does she sleep? How does she behave? And the director told Sandrine Bonnaire she's a girl who never says thank you, she stinks, and she tells everyone to F off. And this created what critics have called an unactressy performance. It's much closer to real life than typical movie acting is. And like I said, Bonnaire went on to win Best Actress at a couple of film awards, including the Los Angeles Film Critics Association Awards. This movie reminded me a lot of Under the Skin, that sort of objective, fly-on-the-wall style storytelling where you can see things happening and you want a hero to intervene, but it's naturalistic, it's non-judgmental. This girl, Mona, gets herself into trouble. She makes bad decisions. She comes across as not a very nice person. She's kind of she's not looking for charity. She's not looking for someone to feel sorry for her. But she's not looking to succeed or anything like that. She's sort of drifting through life. The best moment for me that a lot of people mention was this scene where Mona is drinking cognac and laughing with an old auntie. So there's someone who's looking after their old auntie and she becomes involved in that story. And this old auntie was another example of a non-actor. And the director liked this moment so much, she actually returned to make a documentary about the old lady many years later about her time filming this movie. It doesn't feel like a very 80s movie, but the soundtrack does have some 80s style music on it, and I did spot an arcade machine in one scene. But apart from that, the fashions and things, I mean, it's rural France. We're sort of out in the middle of nowhere in a farming village. People dress for that. They're not dressing to go to the discos in the cities or anything like that. So you can't really tell it's an 80s movie. Now, a lot of people cite Citizen Kane as a template for this movie because it starts with a death and then witnesses recount through their testimonies. They sort of reconstruct the life of the protagonist. In Citizen Kane, of course, it's a wealthy old man, and in this movie, it's a poor young woman, but the stories are similar in some ways. And another interesting part of this movie is Mona travels to a goat farm, which is run by this man who's dropped out of society, who has a PhD in philosophy, and he provides a lot of interesting dialogue, such as saying by proving she's useless, she actually helps the system that she's rejecting. She's not wandering, she's withering, when he's talking about Mona. Now, this man was not an actor. He was an actual philosophy PhD who dropped out and started a goat farm. That's just his goat farm. And I'm sure that a lot of his dialogue was improvised as well. So right at the end, Mona wanders into the local village, the one that's near this vineyard, and they're celebrating Pelisi Day, which is a pagan harvest ritual, I guess, for the picking of the grapes, where men in bizarre costumes, like they're dressed up like forest creatures, I guess they've been stomping some grapes, and they attack her and manhandle her and douse her with wine drinks. We see this happening to another young girl who's sort of in on the fun, but this takes Mona by surprise, and the director Vada calls it her final defilement before her death. Now, Roger Ebert gave the film 4 stars and says, like so many of the greatest films, it tells a very specific story, strong and unadorned, about a very particular person. Although many have shared our time, how many have truly known us? And this movie is 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, with Martin Scorsese saying the director Vada is one of the gods of cinema. So if that doesn't tell you anything, I am giving this 4.5 stars and a Mintox. You should track down this movie, Vagabond, and watch it if you can. But now...
I'm driving along and I'm just singing my song. I'm in a news-free zone.
Well, welcome everybody to the News-Free Zone. It's that time of the podcast where we look back at the news from 1985, so we don't have to watch the news from 2025. And the first news of this week is that Les Miserables premiered at the Barbican Centre in London. So the Barbican Centre opened in 1982. It's a bit of a brutalist postmodern concrete dystopia, but in a bit of a French connection to the movie. This musical, which would become the longest running show in West End history and launched a global phenomenon, it premiered this week. Also, President Reagan welcomed Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew for a state visit. So Singapore transformed from a post-colonial backwater to a gleaming financial hub during the Cold War, representing capitalism's power and its answer to communism in Southeast Asia. And the Prime Minister's authoritarian yet prosperous model would spark debates about democracy. Interesting, we don't have any debates about democracy these days, do we, in 2025? Now, in New York City this week, Nintendo hosted a launch party for the NES. So this wasn't just another product launch. Nintendo was making an audacious bet on a market that everyone else had abandoned after the video game industry collapse of 1983. And their strategy was to sell the NES in toy stores and market it as a toy, just to distance themselves from this games console association. And part of the way that they did that was by including Rob the Robot to sort of distinguish it as a toy. Now, New York City was being used as the test market before a national rollout, which will happen soon. This week, Ricky Wilson, founding member of the B-52s and guitarist of that band, died from AIDS-related complications. Now, we heard about Rock Hudson just the other week. Ricky Wilson was only 32 years old, and the band had just completed recording of their album Bouncing Off Satellites and would basically take a long hiatus as they mourned his death until their 1989 comeback with Love Shack. Now, this week, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded, as it was in 2025 as well. And it went to international physicians for prevention of nuclear war. Isn't that nice? They can just award it to a whole category of people, not any particular person. So they awarded it to international physicians for raising awareness about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear conflicts. Now, just to round off the week, Jan Strustrup published the first edition of the C++ programming language, sending programming into the dark ages for about 35 years or so, until people rediscovered how wonderful plain old vanilla C is, which is a bit where I'm coming from anyway, not too much about that. Let's look over at Usenet now, Usenet being 1985's version of Reddit. So it's the social media that I used to use back in the day. So on net.math, Tom Gramvold posted about ordering a 5x5 Rubik's Cube. Now, I found this interesting because these days we don't think twice about ordering stuff online. He ordered a Rubik's Cube from Hong Kong, and he said it took about a month to actually, between paying for it by posting in a money order and actually receiving a package at his house. Now, these days, it's going to take a couple of days, isn't it? And that's probably going to come from a warehouse close to where you're located anyway, even though it might have been made in China. Now, net.movies, they were chatting about, there's a lot of chatter about the upcoming Alien 2 movie. Now, that wouldn't come out until 1986, and it's one of the best sequels ever. I love Alien and Alien 2. They're both very different movies from two very talented directors, but people already know who's directing it and roughly what the story is. So there must have been a lot of press and interviews going on. Also, Terry Mason said he didn't interview. Terry Mason was a user on net.movies. He wrote a review about Commando, which we saw earlier this year. He said, there's a number of things wrong with this movie, but I enjoyed it. I like watching Arnold grow up in Hollywood. The dialogue is an improvement of what I've seen in his other films. The action is, not very plausible, but it seems tongue-in-cheek, and it can be taken at face value as just entertainment. If you can look past the staggering amount of violence and bloodshed, you should probably see this one. So, yeah, I quite enjoyed Commando when we watched that back in the day. Anton Winteroak said he saw Plenty this weekend. He didn't think too much of it, but the acting was pretty well done. And I thought, what on earth is Plenty? This is another 1985 movie that I've missed out on. It's the second 1985 movie that Meryl Streep was in, the other one being Out of Africa. Sting is in it as well. Of course, he did June, I think, in 1984. And who else is in it? Sam Neill, Tracy Ullman, Charles Dance, John Gielgud, Hugh Laurie, Ian McKellen, and to top it all off, directed by the Australian Fred Shepsky. I can never say his name, Skepsy. Now, have I mentioned this before? I think I've got to put Plenty on my list. It's based on a Broadway production, and the main creative group, the director and some of the actors, would re-team to make A Cry in the Dark in 1988 about the Lindy Chamberlain A Dingo Ate My Baby case. So I found that was very interesting. So I'm going to add Plenty to my list of movies that I should have known about. Now, R.D. Marco wrote a little review, a one-line review of The Jagged Edge, as he called it, or Jagged Edge, which we saw the other week. His review, it's good, go see it. On net.music, Bruce Weimar said that he's looking for a hard-to-find recording of Blue Zoo's Somewhere in the World There's a Cowboy Smiling. Now, of course, I just typed that into YouTube and I can watch it. It's very, very 80s. The best part about the film clip is the bass player just cannot get the smile off his face, and the guy playing the drums just stands up. He's standing up at his acoustic drum kit, which is a very 80s look, isn't it? Now, Chumley Walrus, not his real name, said on net.music, I heard a song off of ZZ Top's new album on the radio. I believe the album's called Afterburner, and the song I heard was Sleeping Bag. It was played on Q107 in Toronto. Now, that's very interesting because in 1985, at the age of 13, I was very much into the Eurythmics. They were my favourite band, but I did record the film clip of Sleeping Bag on my VCR and showed it to some of my school friends who really got deeply into ZZ Top as a result of that, and they went and saw their shows when they toured to Perth. I didn't get into ZZ Top until 3 or 4 years later, when another friend at high school started playing some of their early albums from the 60s and 70s that we really got into. But Afterburner was a pretty good album and a big reinvention of the ZZ Top sound, featuring a different producer and heavy on the synths. I think Eliminator was the first in a series of 3 albums that came out a couple of years before, and then Recycler followed. Recycler, they did the theme song or the music for Back to the Future 2, I think, was on that album as well. It was interesting, now being a fan of They Might Be Giants these days, to see that Afterburner only had 10 songs on it, 5 per side. And what's interesting with ZZ Top is they're still kicking around today. They've been going since 1969. They are still playing gigs these days, even though Dusty Hill, the bass player, died in 2012. He's been replaced by another guy. And I think Afterburner was their highest charting album. If you want to know more ZZ Top, there's a really good documentary about them on Netflix. Now, on net.micro, Jim Forrest wrote that a friend of mine would like to know if there's a relatively easy way of using your video cassette recorder as a way of backing up your hard disk on your K Pro 10. So that triggered a memory of mine, because back in the day I remember seeing newspaper ads for VHS-based backup systems, I think for the Amiga, where you might have a 20 gigabyte or 40 gigabyte hard drive, and you would plug in your VHS recorder to your computer and record some weird pixely images onto your video cassette at a transfer rate of about 9 megabytes per minute. You could actually fit 4 gigabytes on a VHS tape, which is quite interesting. So I guess for daily backups that might have made sense, like for overnight backups for people who didn't want to lose their data. On net.origins, Ted Holden posted a long article about the Archaeopteryx, which is the oldest known bird, with fossils that had been discovered showing a skeleton of a reptilian creature with feathers imprinted in the fossil as well. And apparently back in 1985, Sir Fred Hoyle and a bunch of other people denounced all of the Archaeopteryx fossils as frauds. Now, some of them were in the British Museum of Natural History. Now, these days we know that they weren't frauds, and they actually are evidence of part of the fossil record showing the evolution between reptiles and birds. But back then they were claiming that it's a reptilian fossil decorated with imprints of chicken feathers. So on net.games.board, Jim Gardner posted that the latest issue of Games magazine contains their annual ranking of their top 100 board games. Now, it's very easy these days to go and search for that magazine and see what they are. And it was quite interesting to see some of, well, they weren't just board games, they were games in general. But right at the top, there's games like Charades, like the board game version of Charades, Boggle, Upwards, Go, and even the Aerobee Flying Disc. Now, the Aerobee Flying Disc, which was made for distance and accuracy, I have a little story about throwing that on the roof of the Reed Library at UWA back in the 90s. But there's very few in the ways of what we would consider to be modern board games in the list. I'm thinking things like Settlers of Catan. So, 1985 was not a good time for board games. I probably wouldn't be interested in too many of what was on the top 100 list. Now, to end the news this week, let's travel 360 years before 1985 to the year 1665, where Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary that the Pope is dead. Now, that was completely untrue, but he was in the middle of a pandemic and people were panicking, thinking that all sorts of people were passing away from the Black Plague. He also wrote, the King of France has been stabbed. That also was not true. And he also wrote that Lady Noel, wife of one of England's greatest merchants, has died with grief for the death of her husband. Now, her husband, Sir Martin Noel, did succumb to the plague just days earlier, and his wife did die as well. And what was interesting about that is nobody could determine if Noel died a wealthy man or if he died penniless, despite his huge business dealings as one of England's greatest merchants. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I guess the paper trail, it wasn't as accurate as it would be these days. So there was also a lot of rumours spreading around town about Lord Sandwich being impeached as part of the prize goods scandal that we talked about a few weeks ago, where they'd seized all sorts of goods after a battle. They'd seized them off the Dutch, and they were just divvying them up amongst themselves and selling them off. So, yeah, apparently Lord Sandwich was impeached. So there you go, the news from 1665. Anyway, until next time, don't forget to rewind.